The letter didn't come for Clara Holt. It came for her father, written in a banker's careful hand, and it said what everyone in Dry Hollow already knew, but hadn't yet said out loud. The ranch was mortgaged past saving. 60 days. Then it belonged to someone else. Clara read it at the kitchen table while her father slept in the next room, the way he slept most afternoons now, heavily and without apology. She folded the letter back into its envelope, set it beside the sugar bowl, and went out to feed the horses. She had learned early that problems didn't shrink when you stared at them. She was 24 years old, and she had spent most of those years being described by other people before they had finished looking at her. Too quiet, too particular, too much her mother's eyes and not enough her father's softness. 3 men had come calling over the years, drawn more by the land than by her. And she had known it each time, the way you know a thing in your chest before your mind has caught up. She had said no to all 3 without regret. What she had not expected was what arrived on a Thursday in late September. Not a letter, a man. He came in on foot, which was unusual enough to notice. Most men who passed through Dry Hollow came on horseback or by stage. This one walked out of the eastern ridge as though he had stepped directly out of the landscape, trail-dusted and unhurried, leading a horse that had gone lame somewhere in the long miles behind him. He stopped at the fence post at the edge of the Holt property and looked at the barn the way a man looks at something he needs but hasn't decided yet whether to ask for. Clara was mending a section of fence 30 yards away. She watched him without turning her head fully. Trouble, she thought, or something close enough to it that the difference doesn't matter yet. She was not entirely wrong. His name was Cole Merritt. She didn't learn it that first evening. He asked only if he could pay for a night in the barn and a bucket of feed for his horse, and he offered a fair amount without being asked what was fair. Her father, roused by the knock at the door, looked him over with the practiced eye of a man who had hired and dismissed enough ranch hands to read a stranger quickly. Good enough, her father said finally. Barn's in back, that was all. Cole Merritt slept in the barn that night and was up before sunrise. Clara found him repairing the broken hinge on the barn door, the one her father had been meaning to fix for 2 months, working quietly in the pale early light as though he had been asked to and had simply gotten started. She stood in the doorway of the barn and watched him for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He looked up. He had the kind of face that sunlight and wind had collaborated on over a long time, sharp at the jaw and careful around the eyes, the kind of eyes that registered things without broadcasting what they found. "I know," he said. He went back to the hinge. Clara turned and walked back to the house, but at the porch steps she paused. A man who fixed things without being asked was either decent to his core or trying to earn something without appearing to. She hadn't decided which. She intended to find out. He stayed 3 days, then 4, then a week. There was always a reason, practical and unspoken, a fence line that needed walking. A section of roof over the lean-to that had begun to separate. Her father's horse had thrown a shoe, and Cole had the tools for it and the knowledge to use them correctly, which her father's usual hand did not. The ranch needed what Cole Merritt apparently knew how to give it. Clara noticed things during that week. Small things, the way she had always noticed small things, which was the only advantage she had found so far in being consistently underestimated. She noticed that Cole ate whatever was set in front of him without comment, and always brought his plate to the sink without being asked. She noticed that he spoke to her father with the particular careful respect a man offers someone whose authority has been quietly diminished by time and misfortune, the respect that does not diminish the man further. She noticed that he never looked at the land the way the other 3 men had looked at it. He didn't look at it like something to be acquired. He looked at it the way you look at something that is already hurting, and that you are not entirely sure you can help. On the 6th evening, she brought coffee out to the porch where he was sitting, watching the sun go down behind the western ridge in long bands of copper and dust. He took the cup without a word. They sat in silence for a while. "Where were you headed?" Clara said finally. Before your horse went lame. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Away, he said. She looked at him. From what? Another pause. The kind of pause she had come to recognize as Cole Merritt not being evasive but being precise. From a version of myself I'm not sure I can keep being. Clara looked back at the ridge. The sun had nearly finished its business with the sky. That's either a very honest answer, she said, or a very well-constructed one. He glanced at her then. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the country a smile lived in. I'm not sure there's a difference anymore, he said. It was May Hennessy at the dry goods store who said it first. The way things in small towns are always said first by the person with the least hesitation. You know what he is, May told Clara on a Tuesday, leaning over the counter with the satisfied expression of someone delivering a verdict they have long prepared. Cole Merritt. From up near the Caldera County trouble 2 years back. There were warrants. Clara set her flower on the counter. We're, she said. Beg your pardon? You said were. Past tense. She looked at May evenly. Is there a warrant now? May's expression shifted. Well, not that I've heard precisely. Then I imagine he's paid whatever he owed. She carried her flower home and said nothing to Cole about it. That evening at supper, her father talked about the weather and the price of cattle, and Cole answered everything plainly and asked whether the north pasture gate had been rehung yet, because he'd noticed it was swinging wide, and cattle had a way of noticing opportunity. Her father said he'd been meaning to get to it. Cole said he'd get to it in the morning. Her father nodded, satisfied in the way of a man who has found a thing he needed without having to ask for it. Clara watched them both across the table and said nothing. But something in her chest had gone very quiet, the way a room goes quiet when it stops expecting something and simply settles into what it is. She found him that night at the edge of the north pasture, working the gate hinge by lantern light. It could have waited until morning, she said. I know, he said. I don't sleep well. She leaned against the fence post and watched him work. The lantern threw a warm, narrow circle. Beyond it, the dark was complete and full of small sounds. I heard what May Hennessy said, she told him. His hands didn't stop moving. I figured you would. Do you want to tell me yourself? He set down the wrench. He stood up slowly and looked at her in the way she had noticed. He always looked at things he was deciding about, completely and without hurry. 2 years ago, he said, I rode with men I shouldn't have trusted. I told myself it was necessity. For a while I believed that. He paused. Then a man got hurt who shouldn't have been anywhere near it, and I stopped believing it. What did you do? I turned state's evidence, he said, against men who would have preferred I didn't. Charges were dropped. I walked out of a courthouse in Caldera County with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and a horse I'd bought with the last of my wages. He looked at her steadily. That's what I was riding away from, not the law. The rest of it, Clara was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pasture grass in a long, slow wave. The rest of it, she repeated, the part of you that knows exactly who you were. He said, even after you've stopped being him. She looked at him for a long time. At the tired, careful, quietly honest face of a man who had been carrying an old version of himself like a stone in his coat pocket and hadn't yet decided if he had the right to set it down. That takes courage, she said. What you did. He shook his head slightly. It took fear. The courage came after. Maybe that's what courage is, Clara said. He didn't answer. But he held her gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required, and in that moment something passed between them that had no name yet and didn't need one. The banker came on a Friday. His name was Aldous Prine, and he arrived in a good coat with 2 men behind him and the expression of someone performing an unpleasant duty with more satisfaction than the duty technically required. He asked for Clara's father and found him on the porch. 60 days is up in 12, Prine said. I'll need to know your intentions. Her father looked smaller than Clara had ever seen him. He held his hat in his hands and said nothing useful. It was Cole who came around the side of the house. He had been splitting wood at the far end of the yard, and he set the axe down against the chopping block and walked over without urgency, but without hesitation either. Prine looked at him. "And who are you, Cole Merritt?" he said. "I have a question about the terms." What followed was 20 minutes of the most precise, unhurried negotiation Clara had ever witnessed. Cole had apparently spent the past several days reviewing the mortgage documents her father kept in the kitchen drawer, and he understood them better than either of them had given him credit for. There were terms that could be renegotiated. There were payments that could be restructured. There were options that Prine had not volunteered and apparently had preferred remain unmentioned. By the time Prine left, he was no longer smiling. Her father sat on the porch step and let out a long breath. Clara stood beside Cole in the yard. "You read those documents," she said. "I was looking for the sugar," he said. "I found them instead." She looked at him. "Cole." He met her eyes. "Yes. How long have you been trying to save this ranch?" He was quiet for a moment. "About as long as I've been trying to figure out if I had a reason to stay," he said. The afternoon light lay long and gold across the yard. Somewhere in the pasture, his horse lifted its head and then went back to grazing. Clara looked at the man beside her, the quiet, improbable, entirely decent man who had walked out of an eastern ridge with a lame horse and stayed for reasons he had taken considerable trouble not to say out loud. "You have one," she said. "A reason." He looked at her. "I was hoping you'd say that." They were married in December, the way practical people in practical places get married. Without excess ceremony, but with the particular seriousness of two people who had both been disappointed by life enough to understand what they were promising. May Hennessy attended, and had the grace to look pleased. Clara's father walked her down the aisle of the small church with a steadiness in his step she hadn't seen in 2 years. Cole stood at the front in a clean shirt and the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he had stopped believing he would ever get to. When she reached him, he took her hand carefully. "Both," he said quietly. And she knew what he meant without explanation, the way she had come to know most things about him, not because he told her, but because she had learned to read the language of a man who meant every word he said, and so said very few of them. The following spring, the north pasture was full again. The gate hung straight. The barn roof had been properly repaired. The mortgage had been restructured into something survivable, and the kitchen table had recovered its old habit of having people around it who intended to stay. Clara stood on the porch one morning in April, with coffee going warm in her hands, and watched Cole walk the fence line in the early light, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who knew where he was going because he knew, for the first time in a long time, where he was. She had been the rancher's daughter nobody wanted, the girl too quiet, too particular, too much of her mother's eyes, and an outlaw, reformed, precise, and genuinely decent, had looked at her across a kitchen table and seen exactly what she was, not what she could offer, not what she stood to inherit, just her. She took a sip of her coffee and watched the morning come in wide and unhurried over the eastern ridge, and thought that some stories don't announce themselves when they begin. They simply start quietly, with a man at a fence post and a woman deciding whether to look away. She hadn't, and that, it turned out, had been enough. If you stay for the quiet ones, the stories that don't rush, that let the silences speak. There are more waiting here, each one a different life, a different frontier, a different two people finding their way towards something real. Tell me where you were when this one found you. What corner of the world, what hour of the night? Leave it below, and tell me honestly, what did this story do right? Your words are how these stories grow.